30 seconds. 20 seconds. 10 seconds.
Hi,
My name's J.C. McCauley.
I'm Naisha McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
Good morning again. This is Jonathan Small, host and producer of Face to Face. Face to Face is one of two different programs that I have the pleasure of hosting and producing live every single week at AccessTV.org studio. Face to Face is a show that's designed to ask the guests the hard questions and give you, the viewers, the answers and information that you deserve to know. This morning we have a tremendous politically, civil rights, economic, human rights individual that has an activism in him that stands out beyond the norm. He has an extensive background in television, radio, print, journalism, and he knows this particular city and metro area backwards better than anybody that I can think of. The guest this morning on the Face to Face talk show is lifelong political, civil, human rights activist Frank Joyce. Good morning, Frank. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Jonathan, and I've enjoyed our conversation so far. So I'm pumped up about this one.
Likewise as well. Frank, do you want to let people know a little bit more about yourself briefly, or do you want to jump right into our main topics of discussion?
Let's jump right in. That's a good way for people to find out what I'm talking about.
Okay, Frank, the history of Detroit, Michigan, for people on the outside, the quick assumption is it's the auto industry capital of the world at one point. And the auto industry kind of was the blueprint, the economic engine that kind of drove Detroit to become at one point the richest city in the United States. Can you do a historical assessment on Detroit and say the starting point would be the auto industry, or would it be something of another industry that came before the auto industry that kind of made Detroit the
Yeah.
economic hub that it used to be?
I always like to start by zooming out as far as possible.
Mm.
And I love to recommend a book by Tia Miles called The Dawn of Detroit that takes Detroit all the way back to the early 1700s and talks about why Detroit is different. We have a show here in Detroit, Jonathan, similar to yours, called Detroit is Different. And that goes back to the convergence in Detroit of the French, the British, the white settlers, the indigenous, enslaved black people, free black people. We had the total mix here in Detroit almost from the beginning. Now, fast forward to the 20th century, of course, that mix was profoundly altered by the explosive growth of the auto industry, which contributed to attracting both migrants from the South, black people in particular, but whites as well. Henry Ford when the Ford Motor Company was just starting, recruited in the South. People may have heard the phrase the $5 a day wage attracted a lot of people. But ironically, less people are less aware of the fact that Henry Ford was a notorious anti-Semite. And as a result of that, that in a twisted way led him to recruit workers from the Middle East. So Detroit now has a substantial, Detroit and its suburbs, a substantial Arab population from Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, all over. So there's the before the auto industry, during the auto industry, and less so, but still the auto industry is a big part of Detroit, but by no means is it the only part.
Well, Frank, was the race riots in 1943 a big setback for Detroit, or was it just a setback, let's say, for blacks and lower social economic skilled
True.
people? Could you kind of give a little indication on how
Yeah,
that impacted?
that's a really good question.
Mm,
I think that what it was in part was uh, because for the reasons I just said, Detroit is kind of a microcosm of the history of the United States.
mm.
A lot of people don't look at it this way, but from day one, I like to say from Plymouth Rock and to Jamestown, the United States has always been racially diverse. The white settlers brought their ideas of white superiority with them from Europe when they came, and they immediately encountered indigenous people who were not white, and simultaneously started a very racialized slave trade with Africans. So the question has never been, are we diverse? We have been diverse from the beginning. And to bring that into the Detroit context, part of what 1943's uprising or riot, uh, whatever we call it, was about how are we dealing with this diversity? How is Detroit dealing with the Great Migration from the South, with having now this substantial population of black workers in the middle of a war and huge factory production and an ongoing housing crisis? Black people did not find it easy to find housing in Detroit as they started to arrive in large numbers. And white people were resistant to blacks working in the factories and living in neighborhoods. And in 1943, that, as so often is also part of the history of the USA, resulted in massive violence. And yes, um, in some ways, we're still living with the legacy of that and with the struggle of who has access to land. Where can, for example, more specifically, black people work? Where can black people live? Where can black people go to school? And what are the forces that are uh, affecting those questions?
Well, Frank, wasn't at this point in 1943, let's say Detroit was still developing the auto industry, and this was before you had technically, I think, the large segment of white flight and
Uh-huh.
industries and people moving to residential suburbs. But did this kind of put, let's say, Detroit in the wrong direction towards people looking at Detroit as a place to move to, or did it really have very little to do with the perceptions that, let's say, the great migration of black people and other people throughout the country had towards Detroit?
Well, a lot of that migration had taken place, and of course, not just to Detroit, but
Mm.
to Pittsburgh, to Chicago, to Cleveland, to New York, to many northern and to some extent western cities as well. But part of the mythology that we have, and that white people in particular have, and northern white people in particular, is that somehow, we've always been more welcoming or more accommodating or more supportive of racial diversity. That's not true. It was never the case as blacks left the South for understandable reasons and came to the North that they were necessarily welcomed with open arms. And particularly as the numbers of blacks grew, many white people, not all, of course, but many white people saw that as a threat. They saw that as somehow, I sometimes call it habitat loss. They saw it as something that was uh, upsetting their all white way of life. And it was. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And there were various reactions to that that continue to this day. But I have to say that the dominant reaction was then and still is hostile. Uh, by 1943, I think it would be interesting to look up the numbers. I don't know what the percentage of Black people as part of the overall Detroit population was. It continued to grow, but we know for sure that by 1950 and in the post-war period, the government and financial institutions very deliberately created a strategy of reinforcing residential segregation. And they did that in part by investing in suburbs. But before they started investing in suburbs, they started investing in neighborhoods, in the case of Detroit, within the city limits. To this day, there is still in the northeast part of Detroit, I take people there on tours all the time, a place called the Burwood Wall. And the Burwood Wall is half a mile long and about 6 feet high. And it was constructed because a real estate developer wanted federal and bank loan guarantees for developing then vacant property towards the outer limits of Detroit. And he got the guarantees that he wanted on the condition that he build a wall that would distinguish where white people could live and where black people could live. And as I say, that wall has now been repurposed in the community and it's been painted by artists and there's a historical marker there. But it is a very dramatic symbol of residential segregation within the city limits and then very shortly thereafter beyond the city limits.
Well, Frank, I think one of the big difference maybe people might need to know, unlike other places like Rosewoods where blacks had an established base in the geographical region where they lived,
Uh-huh.
blacks really didn't have that strong a presence in 1943. And you mentioned the numbers. I believe
Right.
Detroit population peak were 1.8 million in
Yeah.
1950, and I
Uh-huh.
think
That sounds
if
right.
right, and I think 1.5 of the 1.8 million were white people. So blacks had a very small percentage in the city. But why that's so relevant is Detroit would now lose populations for several different decades, where the population dropped from the peak of 1.8
Right.
million down to somewhere in the 600,000s. But
Yes.
wouldn't you say the development of the interstate highway systems, building up the residential suburbs, not to mention that many of the auto factories also started to exit out of city limits of Detroit to the surrounding towns and suburbs and other parts of Michigan. But was this really a business practical strategy, or was it having something to do with competition? Because there's many different theories that people may try to figure out why did Detroit lose that amount of people over
Uh-huh.
over that course of time.
Well, you're exactly right about those assumptions, and it's a very good question. I think one of the places where we kind of get confused and go off track,
Mm.
this is a cultural phenomenon that we could talk about separately, but we think things have to be completely either one way or another way. And so the expansion of auto factories, for example, outside of the city limits of Detroit, initially into other parts of southeast Michigan and other parts of Michigan, Lansing and Grand Rapids, for example, um, was partly driven by the growth of the industry itself. More cars are produced, more people are buying cars. That leads to more production, and so capacity has to be increased. But race is always in the picture, and so investing in areas that were either rural or semi-rural, but also populated exclusively by white people, was a driving factor in how General Motors and Ford and Chrysler, we now call them the Legacy Three, here in Detroit, expanded their production. There's one big exception to that, though, and that is that while the original Ford factory was in Highland Park, Michigan, which is a small community completely surrounded by Detroit, um, fairly early on in the 1920s, Henry Ford started building the Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan. And Dearborn is an immediately adjacent suburb of Detroit to the west. And of course, the Rouge plant to this day is an industrial wonder of the world in which raw materials, rubber, iron ore, and so on, come in on boats and trains and trucks, and a finished vehicle comes out the other end, but it has its own steel factory. It at one point had its own tire factory. It was called Vertical Integrated Manufacturer. And at one point, at its peak, the Rouge plant employed 125,000 people in one factory complex. But again, that was not within the city limits of Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
Other factories were, but that Ford and Ford's headquarters uh, has always been, or almost always been, in Dearborn, Michigan, not the Detroit city limits. So race and economics are just inextricably intertwined in U.S. history, again, from Plymouth Rock and Jamestown forward. And that's true as to how the auto industry expanded in Detroit as well. I don't know if that's helpful. I hope so.
Well, Frank. One part of the answer, or I guess the answer to the question, I don't know if I really got, was the fact that if that amount of people would be able to exit out of Detroit over a 60-year period,
Uh-huh.
wouldn't that be a direct pinpoint towards how Detroit basically fell apart towards bankruptcy, or were there other factors beyond just white flight, resources being exited out of the city, and basically leaving a large segment of people with very limited economic,
Uh-huh.
political resources?
Well, that's a really good pivot, Jonathan, to a couple of questions. To be sure, white flight, and there were waves of it, starting in the 1950s and again in the 1960s. There was a rebellion in 1967. It accelerated again after that. There are actually signs in the last 5 years or so that whites, in small numbers, but measurable numbers, are returning to Detroit. Um, so this conflict, this constant churning conflict over who has what access to what land relative to where people can live, where can people go to school, where can people consume cultural entertainment, where can people work. Um, this is never not in turmoil. But on the other hand, one of the things that we feel strongly about in Detroit, well, it's got two parts to it, I guess. Not everything's about money.
Mm-hmm.
Detroit is a very rich city and has never not been a rich city throughout all of this demographic and population turmoil. And what I mean by that is that we are rich in culture, we are rich in spirit, we are rich in political energy and sophistication and innovation. And we continue to produce, let's just talk about music for a minute, because if people know anything about Detroit, they know about Motown. Um, but Motown is by no means the only musically, culturally significant export, if you will, from Detroit. Techno music has a very rich history in Detroit. There's a music festival every year now for at least 10 years on Memorial Day weekend. It's now called Movement. People come from all over the world to Detroit on Memorial Day weekend uh, to experience sort of nonstop multiple venues of techno music. Detroit has a very rich history in jazz. Detroit has a very rich history in radical politics, from James and Grace Boggs and General Baker and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and so on. So it's hard to see this from the outside, but from the inside looking out, um, we feel that people outside looking in make us to be victims in a way that we don't feel victims. It's not that there hasn't been white flight or economic exploitation. My God, has there been? But money isn't everything either. And we pride ourselves on making a way out of no way, for example, and of not necessarily measuring everything by the almighty dollar, which I guess is a kind of a radical way to look at the world right there.
Well, Frank, that's an excellent point that you just made because obviously I was gearing this format just towards the economics
Uh-huh.
and the numbers of people, businesses leaving.
And that's important. I'm not trying to say it isn't, but
Right.
it's just, it's not the only lens through which to uh, understand the world at large or Detroit in particular.
Yeah, but Frank, not to squash what you just said, and it's real relevant. And obviously, if the people in Detroit, and I don't know if as a whole they feel content, because I don't think you should ever feel content or rest on your laurels. But let's
Right.
just say, for the sake of it, most people that live in Detroit really feel like they are part of a great city. From the outside that you just mentioned, people hear the murder capital of the
Uh-huh.
country at certain times. You not just hear, but bankruptcy was relevant. You hear corruptions with the Kwame
Mhm.
Kilpatrick mayoral administration,
Mhm.
favoritism, nepotisms. You hear some ugly parts of Detroit from a national spectra. Can you really offset those things and sell Detroit on the good things that you just mentioned, or do you have to kind of balance both out at the same time?
Well, again, I don't think it's all one thing or all the other.
Mm,
I think one question is, well, let's just talk for a minute about the reputation of Detroit. As we know, uh, in 2016 and in 2020 and currently, Donald Trump, for example, likes to demonize Detroit as he likes to demonize any place that is predominantly not white. Uh, and so he has made disparaging remarks about Detroit, and Detroit was for many years as kind of a punching bag uh, in the national conversation. But I see that more in the context of the hundreds of years racial conversation and the demonization, the need on the part of white people to demonize black people, and the degree to which white identity itself is constructed not on what it is, but on what it is not. James Baldwin, who was very much influence on my early life and my political awareness, I think described that very accurately in the 1960s. So another way to maybe answer a question with the question is, well, who benefits from talking trash about Detroit? Who in the national media, what national political figures, what's the advantage of constantly emphasizing negative things about Detroit and not paying attention to some of the things I was talking about earlier in terms of culture and politics and social innovation. What we know is a function, this is kind of a cliche of my own making, which I like, but what we know depends on where we point our flashlight or our microscope or our telescope or our mirror. Um, and every city, certainly, every big city in the United States has a long history of political corruption. I mean, many people, even young people today, may have heard of Tammany Hall in New York, and Chicago has a legendary reputation for political corruption. So this seems to come with the territory of our society and of our culture. And it's up to us, right? I mean, we have some control over whether we decide uh, to look at more positive aspects of any situation, whether it's Detroit or not. I'll just wrap this up with this. Um, there's a wonderful movie that came out a couple of years ago. I think it's based on a book called The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. Um, and there was a CNN, I believe it was, no, Peacock made a movie based on the book a couple of years ago about the fact that Rosa Parks lived most of her life not in Montgomery, Alabama. She lived most of her life in Detroit, Michigan, because this is where she moved to at a certain point after the Montgomery bus boycott was completed and so on. She worked in the office of Congressman John Conyers for many years and was very involved with Coleman Young and in the political life of Detroit. Uh, and that's a positive part of the positive life of Rosa Parks. But many people, probably young people, may not even be aware that Rosa Parks had lived in Detroit. Again, what we see depends on where we look.
Yeah. Well, Frank, can you really, not to go negative, but can you really do justice for the history of Detroit and not talk about the 67 riots, how that was making
Oh,
national news, how they felt that Detroit was really one of the worst cities at the
uh-huh.
time towards
Sure.
uprising and riots?
Uh-huh.
Or could you we just skip over that? I mean, what was your take?
Oh,
I
no,
mean,
no,
you,
no,
you, you
no.
can't skip over
I
that?
would never suggest skipping over that.
Mhm.
And where I often start this conversation, because uh, when people talk about Detroit, uh, that's one of the things that they know. It's one of the, whether I bring it up or not, it's always going to come up in the conversation. One place I start, and this is debated to this day, it's what is it? March 25th, 2025. You can still get in an argument in Detroit or Detroit suburbs about was it a riot or a rebellion?
Mhm.
Because depending on your political point of view, it was, to characterize it as a riot deprives it of any political content or significance. A riot is like, kids on spring break go berserk and wild and get drunk and do crazy things. A rebellion sort of echoes, well, the United States had a rebellion against Britain. There's something politically dignified about calling something a rebellion as distinct from a riot. Again, I don't think there's such a clean answer to that. If all you saw was TV footage of things burning and looting going on and so on, um, how would you interpret that? What language would you use to describe it? Again, that's a question within the question. Was it a big game changer in the history and in the city life of Detroit? Absolutely, it was. My own position, and I've written a fair amount about this over the years, including I've also written about the vocabulary of what do we call it. Um, but I believe that in the immediate aftermath of 1967, well, let me zoom out it again just a little bit more before I say this. It is we are ours is a culture of violence. We were a nation founded in violence. You can't have settler colonialism, and you can't have slavery, and you can't have Jim Crow. You can't have what the U.S. is without constant violence. But like a lot of things, that ebbs and flows. So, think about the mid 1960s in the United States of America. What is the single dominant thing that's going on in the world in the mid 1960s that's affecting the United States? I would maintain that would be the war on Vietnam.
Hmm.
And the rebellion, which I still choose to call it, was initiated by a police raid at the corner of 12th and Claremont on a party that was taking place to celebrate the return of a black soldier from Vietnam. Why was that a cause of celebration? Because disproportionately, blacks who got drafted to serve in Vietnam didn't come home alive and didn't come home in one piece. So when that happened, and that soldier, by the way, if you go back and look at the pictures from that night, that soldier attended that party in his uniform. And there's a very direct connection between the violence being perpetrated by the United States in Vietnam and the violence that was perpetrated on black people by the Detroit Police Department for decades prior to 1967. If it was a rebellion, if we're going to use that term at all, most directly it was a rebellion against the oppressive authority of the then all-white Detroit Police Department. And the fact that the Detroit Police Department had an undercover agent infiltrating that party was itself evidence of the constant surveillance by the police of black people in Detroit and the brutality with which they were treated. Remember, 43 people died in the this is the official number at any rate, in the 1943 riot.
Hmm.
Every single one of them was black.
Right.
Now, that riot, by the way, was hand-to-hand combat between black citizens and white citizens. It's called a race riot because that's what it was. It was white people attacking black people. There was a famous incident. I know I'm meandering a little bit here on the timeline,
Hmm.
but there was a famous incident that's relevant here. There's a historical marker there today of an African American doctor whose name was Ossian Sweet, who bought a house on Garland Street in Detroit. I don't remember the year, easy to look up. Um, in a predominantly white neighborhood, the house was surrounded by a white mob. He defended his property and shot into the crowd, and someone was killed in that incident. He was defended by Clarence Darrow. That too is a part of the Detroit legend of white black conflict in Detroit. Coming back to 1967, there was very much just you can't exaggerate the degree of pent-up resentment of ordinary Black people at how they would be routinely treated by the police. The only parallel that we have that younger viewers might understand of this was the killing of George Floyd and Eric Garner and others that became prominent in a later time. But this was just routine, the way life was in Detroit in the mid 1960s. So you get this convergence, violence in Vietnam. And remember, in April of 1967, Dr. King had given his famous Beyond Vietnam speech, in which he connected the dots of the violence in Vietnam and the violence in U.S. historically in U.S. foreign policy. He uses the phrase in that speech, the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. It was true then, it's still true to this day, but it was very much true in this convergence of daily police violence in the Black community in Detroit and the return of this soldier from Vietnam. Now, maybe I should stop there.
Yeah, well, Frank, I know I'm debating should I just go up to the top of the hour, but I'm more likely gonna just cut the show down to the normal time and do a part 2 segment because I can't cover everything that I really want to cover in one particular show. And there's a lot of more important things about Detroit that I think the people need to know about. So let's just say, for the sake of it, I do want to ask you briefly about the Coleman Young's impact on Detroit from him becoming the first Black mayor of Detroit towards the current level of the city government in Detroit right now.
Sure. Well, again, I think Coleman was obviously a very significant figure, still a controversial figure. If you mention his name in many white settings to this day, you'll find yourself immediately in a political argument. Despite the fact that he had an impeccable record of balancing budgets, an impeccable record of economic development in various ways, an impeccable record of being free of corruption, which, as we said earlier, is common in many U.S. cities. But he also was very much a Detroiter in the Detroit is different sense of Black mayors, which other cities had and continue to have, because he came out of the radical tradition of Detroit. He had been a state senator before running for mayor, and picking up on what I was just saying about 1967 a minute ago, he ran on a platform of reforming the police department. And there was a particular unit that was associated with white police oppression in Detroit at that time. It was called STRESS, which was an acronym for safe something, safe streets, something, something, something. And STRESS were specially marked cars that were always populated by white officers that carried extra heavy armaments and that were basically perceived as there for the purpose of just conspicuously asserting control in Black neighborhoods. And that was Coleman's primary campaign platform, was that he would abolish STRESS. And the first day he took office, he abolished that unit of the Detroit Police Department. But he also came out of a radical tradition. He testified before the House Un-American Affairs Committee earlier in his life, having been accused of being associated with the Communist Party. His attorney who represented him in those hearings was a guy by the name of George Crockett, a very distinguished Black attorney from Detroit who went on to become a judge and a member of Congress himself. So Coleman represents not just black people getting elected to office in northern cities, but in his case, a radical black person with a radical black past getting elected. And that's one of the reasons I think that he uh, became so controversial. On the other hand, he was reelected, what, three times? I think he served many terms of office and is still beloved, certainly by most black people, and a significant segment because he always went out of his way. He had many whites who served in his administration. He had a very biracial approach uh, to government, but he also had entrenched opposition in a way comparable, for example, to how Barack Obama had entrenched opposition to his election and again to his reelection. It does come back again, Jonathan, to uh, we're such a racialized society, uh, at least still, and for the time being,
Mhm.
uh, that's always a factor, and certainly was a factor in Coleman's election and in his many terms in office.
Well, Frank, I just felt that you can't do justice without talking about Detroit and not mention Coleman Young's
Oh, indeed.
legacy and impact, however people view Coleman
Yeah.
Young as a mayor. And I think we did cover a lot of critical areas of Detroit. There's some other things I do want to talk about, but I don't want to really put all of this in one show. So I do want to kind of wrap it up just briefly. But
Uh-huh.
just to give a final, let's say, assessment of Detroit on a positive level, crime has dropped with homicides tremendously from the peaks of, let's say, the 80s,
Absolutely.
90s, of the
Yes.
600s. I think the lowest point recently, homicides, and it's still a high number, but I think it was 204, 202. So
Uh-huh.
homicides have gone down. People are slowly, not in high numbers, but Detroit population for the first time since probably the 50s or even before then grew. It's not growing fast, but it's at least not decreasing. But to kind of end on this particular segment, if you was going to sell Detroit or sell the Detroit metro area, would you say you could move to Detroit, the metro area, live in a place like Auburn Hills, and then if you want to enjoy the beauty and the great things of Detroit, you can take a quick 20 to 30-minute drive and be downtown, and you could still say that I'm part of a great city. But wouldn't it be difficult for a city like Detroit that many people will still say areas of the east side and the other parts of the city is really being left behind, left out of the big economic future of downtown Detroit? And the greater Detroit region is just, you have some great areas. You got some still struggling cities like Pontiac, Flint, or you just can't look at selling Detroit on that level. I mean, what's the best way that you could think of towards selling the city of Detroit for people out there?
As best I can, I'll recount word for word a conversation I overheard in the Salt Lake City airport about a month ago. I was changing planes there, coming back to Detroit, um, and it was a long layover. There was a woman who sort of was wheeled into the waiting area in a wheelchair, had her leg up, and was clearly wearing a cast, a young woman, a young white woman. Um, and as we were sitting there, she got into a conversation with a young white man um, who was sitting next to her. And she said she had broken her leg in a skiing accident the day before, and that she was on her way back home to recuperate. But the conversation quickly turned. I was just stunned. I still remember this so clearly. She could not stop talking about how much she enjoyed living in Corktown, which is a neighborhood in the city limits of Detroit, and about how safe she felt and about how the quality of life relative to restaurants and entertainments and walkability. She happened to work for Ford, and her job was in the recently rebuilt and rehabilitated old train station in downtown Detroit, which sat vacant for decades, in which Ford, to its credit, invested $1 billion to rehabilitate and is a stunning building. But when I referred earlier to whites moving back to Detroit in small numbers, I think that those numbers, and again, I don't want to be associated with whites are the benchmark for success, or whites are the benchmark for wealth, or whites are the benchmark for much of anything. But I do want to point out that young white people who are moving to Detroit in measurable, significant numbers now are moving here because it's diverse. They're not moving out because it's diverse. They're not moving from Detroit to Auburn Hills. The white people who are going to do that were an earlier generation, and they've already done it. And so I think I'm a Detroit chauvinist, if you haven't figured that out by now. It should be clear. I think Detroit is one of the richest cities in the world now because I think we are an incipient version, and there's no guarantee about this, but we are trying to figure out this age-old diversity problem. How can we take this whole racialized identity system that we grow up with and celebrate diversity, tolerate it, welcome it, and make diversity as a strength, not just a slogan, something that is actually working? And I see conversations throughout Detroit. There's an enormously successful urban farming movement. There are all sorts of pockets of cultural development in Detroit. There are urban gardens. There's a recently opened, uh, beautiful People's Food Co-op store right on the main street of Detroit, Woodward Avenue. There is a vitality and a vibrance. If you're thinking about coming to Southeast Michigan, the last, not talk no trash about Auburn Hills
Mhm.
or Sterling Whites or any place else, the place you should look first is Detroit,
Mhm.
not the suburbs. That's my spiel.
Well, Frank,
That's my commercial.
right, right. Frank, I always try to find an excellent way to end a particular program, and you definitely ended it on an excellent assumption, excellent assessment. And I really don't have to bring you back technically for a part two, but you're always welcome in the very near future or the future if I want to just talk about anything, even beyond Detroit, because I think you are a book like a book of encyclopedia. I think I can find any particular topic or issue as a former political, human, civil rights
Well, thank
activism,
you.
television, and you could be the right person for that particular topic. But as I ask every single guest every week, is there any last words briefly that they would like for people to know about their self or what they're currently doing? Feel free to express yourself.
Well, thank you. I have really appreciated this conversation. Um, in terms of Jonathan, what you were just saying, I'll maybe finagle myself an invitation back because in a couple of weeks, another part of my personal history is that I was very active in the anti-war movement and back in the day, and people may have picked up on that too. But I'll be making a trip back to Vietnam because this is the 50th anniversary of what we in the United States think of as the end of the Vietnam War. And in Vietnam, what they think of as reunification, as when they were able to sort of put back together the division of their country that had been created by the United States and created by a long history of colonialism and so on and so forth. And I'm very much looking forward to this trip for understanding um, the particular role that Vietnam plays in the world now, because of its history of defending itself from an invasion by the United States, but also where it sits in the geopolitical scheme of things with China and on the one side, and it's very complicated, but at the moment, very healthy relationship with the United States on the other side. So from the global to the local, we also have quite an active and vibrant anti-racist group in the suburb of Grosse Pointe, Michigan. And we have just done part one. I understand some things take more than more than one session to explain of a webinar commemorating a speech that was given on March 14th, 1968, in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, then an all-white suburb, now itself somewhat diversified. On March 14th, 1968, 3 weeks to the day before Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, as we know. And we'll be doing the second part of that webinar on April 4th uh, at 7 o'clock in the evening. But in examining that event and the arc of very local history from 1968 to the present, we're having a very rich conversation again about this idea of we are diverse, we are racially diverse, we are ethnically diverse, we are religiously diverse. That is who we are as a people. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to handle that? And as we sit here today, and whatever day it is of the Trump administration, obviously this question is up for grabs in some ways, I think maybe in a different way than it ever has been in the whole history of the country. So I've been lucky enough to live to a pretty advanced age. I call myself an elder now. I resisted that for a long time, but now I embrace being an elder and having, if you live long enough, you see a lot of things. And I've seen a lot of things in the world and a lot of things in Detroit. And I still am, but wow, is this an interesting time to be alive? And do I say that with some trepidation about my grandchildren and the problems that we will apparently be handing off to them? I do, but I also interact with a lot of young people, and they have access to information at their age that, wow, I was completely oblivious to, having grown up in an all-white environment and gone to all-white schools all the way through high school. So fasten your seatbelts, I guess, as the saying goes.
Well, Frank, Joyce, those words are going to be your last words. Those are well taken. Have a very safe trip to Vietnam. Wish you the very best of luck at what you're working towards.
Thank you.
And it was an
Thank you.
honor to meet you, an honor to interview you this morning on the Face to Face Talk Show. And I have your contact information. I'm pretty sure I'm going to reach out to you before the end of
Wonderful.
the year.
I'd love that. It was great.
And then also, I appreciate you taking the invitation, because I reached out to some key people in Detroit, and they just weren't ready to come on. So I'll leave it at that. But until we meet again, Frank, you have a very safe rest of your day as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Take care.
Peace.
All right. Okay, this is Jonathan Small. I just enjoyed hosting this edition of the Face to Face Talk Show with the special guests, lifelong political, civil, civil and human rights community activists. And I thought Frank Joyce brought an honest assessment. He told the truth. He tried to be honest and promote the city of Detroit and be frank about the realities towards the history of the city. And I hope for you, the viewers, you found this particular show interesting and informative as well. Currently don't have a particular show that I'm going to do next week. It could be an All About You biographical show, or it could be a face-to-face public affairs show. But until I see you again, for people out there, have a very blessed day and keep the faith. Thank you.